The chief physician wouldn't even look at my face for years until the unknown woman I saved in that storm woke up and shook the whole hospital with a single sentence. That night, I didn't just save a life. I pulled the plug on everyone who ignored me. When you hear what happened in that room and who that woman turned out to be, you won't believe how justice was served. Please subscribe to the channel before we continue and write in the comments what justice means to you. Because what you are about to hear is the proof of the great victory that comes at the end of patience. I am Charli Dawson. I am 31 years old, and I was no different than a ghost wandering the corridors of St. Anne Medical Center. I am in love with my profession, yes. But everyone here, the seniors, the doctors, even the interns, saw me as a nobody. I was the person who was always put last on the duty rosters, whose table was left empty during coffee breaks, and who was told you stand aside Charli in an emergency. That day was no different. The chief physician, Dr. Reynolds, bumped into my shoulder while passing me in the hallway and didn't even turn around to apologize. I just heard him tell his assistant to take the skilled nurses to the private wing tonight and send the dead weight to the ER. Dead weight. That was me. That night, during that terrible storm that cut off electricity to the whole city, they put me on duty in the most desolate corner of the emergency room. They mocked me, saying, "Nobody comes here. You'll be comfortable." But fate had completely different plans for me. Towards midnight, while thunder shook the windows of the hospital, the doors of the emergency room opened with a loud noise. There was a woman on the stretcher, covered in blood and unrecognizable. She had no ID on her. Her clothes were covered in mud and blood. The other nurses panicked. Dr. Reynolds was nowhere to be found. He was busy attending to the rich patients upstairs, and the rookie doctor in the ER had frozen upon seeing the blood. The woman was fading away. The lines on the monitor had started to flatten. That was the moment the silent Charli inside me stepped aside. I didn't ask anyone. I didn't ask for permission. I stepped forward. "Give me the intubation tube. Immediately," I shouted. Even I was surprised by the authority in my voice. It was so clear and harsh that the nurses who ignored me started doing what I said like robots. When I pressed my hands on the woman's chest to stop the bleeding, I didn't know I was playing the biggest gamble of my life. Minutes passed, like hours. I corrected her breathing, opened vascular access, and in those seconds, I literally ripped her heart, which had gone into shock, back from the brink of death with my bare hands. When the storm subsided towards the morning, the woman had stabilized, but she was still registered as Jane Doe. I didn't leave her bedside for even a second. With her IV drip in my hand, I waited with my eyes on the monitor. And when the morning sun hit the room, the woman opened her eyes. At that moment, Dr. Reynolds and his team entered the room. When he saw me there, he scrunched up his face. "Charli, what are you doing here? Get out. Let the cleaners come and wipe the room," he scolded. He was putting me in that invisible, that worthless nobody place again. Just as I was heading for the door, a weak but ice-cold, sharp voice was heard from behind me. "She is not going anywhere." Everyone froze. The woman lying in the bed was looking directly at me, not at Dr. Reynolds. Then she slowly turned her gaze to the doctors and said that sentence. "My name is Olivia Hartwell. I am the daughter of the governor of Pennsylvania." The room turned to ice. The file in Dr. Reynolds' hand fell to the floor. Olivia looked at Reynolds' terrified face, smiled, and held my hand. And the only person who kept me alive in this hospital is this woman. "Now call my father. I have things to tell him, especially about you." The silence in that room was so thick you could cut it with a scalpel, and I swear I heard Dr. Reynolds' heart skip a beat right there in front of me. His face went from pale white to a sickly green in about 3 seconds flat, and I watched as the man who had spent years treating me like I was nothing more than a smudge on his perfectly polished shoes suddenly realized that the woman whose life I had saved was about to become his worst nightmare. Olivia Hartwell squeezed my hand tighter, and I felt the warmth of her gratitude flow through her fingers into mine. And in that moment, I understood that everything was about to change, but I had no idea just how deep this rabbit hole was going to go. Within 20 minutes, the hospital was swarming with security personnel in black suits and earpieces, and I watched through the window as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the emergency entrance, and out stepped Governor James Hartwell himself, flanked by what looked like half the state police force. The man was tall and imposing with silver hair and a jaw that could have been carved from granite, and when he walked through those hospital doors, every single person in the hallway straightened up like they were soldiers at attention. Dr. Reynolds was sweating through his expensive shirt, and I could see the dark patches spreading under his arms as he tried to compose himself and put on that charming smile he usually reserved for wealthy donors, but it came out looking more like a grimace of pain. Governor Hartwell didn't even glance at Reynolds when he passed him in the hallway, and he walked straight into Olivia's room where I was still standing beside her bed, checking her vitals because unlike everyone else in this hospital, I actually cared about doing my job, regardless of who was watching. The governor's eyes were wet with tears when he saw his daughter alive and breathing, and he rushed to her side and took her other hand in both of his. And for a moment, this powerful man who controlled the fate of millions of people looked just like any other father who had almost lost his child. Olivia smiled weakly at her father and said, "Dad, this is Charli Dawson, and she is the only reason I'm still breathing right now. Because when I came in here dying and covered in blood, every single person in this hospital either panicked or didn't know what to do. But she stepped up without hesitation and saved my life." The governor turned to look at me, and his eyes were intense and searching like he was trying to see into my soul and determine if I was worthy of the gratitude he was about to bestow upon me. And then he did something that shocked everyone in that room, including me. He stood up, walked over to where I was standing, and he hugged me. Not a polite handshake or a formal thank you, but a real genuine hug from a father whose daughter had been given back to him, and I felt his shoulders shake slightly as he whispered in my ear, "Thank you for giving me back my little girl." When he pulled away, he wiped his eyes and turned to face Dr. Reynolds, who had somehow materialized in the doorway, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world, but standing there under the governor's gaze. Governor Hartwell's expression changed in an instant from grateful father to the political force that had won 3 consecutive elections, and he said in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, "I want a full report on my desk within the hour about what happened here last night. And I want to know exactly who was on duty when my daughter arrived and who made the decisions that saved her life. Because from what Olivia has told me, there seems to be a significant discrepancy between the people who should have been helping and the person who actually did." Dr. Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but the governor held up his hand and said, "I'm not finished yet." And Reynolds' mouth snapped shut so fast I heard his teeth click together. The governor continued, "I have already spoken with the hospital board, and effective immediately, there will be a full investigation into the staffing procedures and treatment protocols at this facility, because my daughter has shared some very concerning information with me about how certain staff members are treated here and how resources are allocated." He paused and looked directly at me and said, "Ms. Dawson, I would like you to be present for all meetings regarding this investigation, because you are the only person in this building who has demonstrated the competence and dedication that I expect from a medical professional." The next few hours were a complete blur of activity, and I found myself sitting in the hospital administrator's office, surrounded by lawyers and board members and official-looking people with clipboards and recording devices, while they asked me to recount in detail everything that had happened the night before. I told them the truth about how I had been assigned to the emergency room as punishment about how Dr. Reynolds had called me. Dead weight about how the other nurses had panicked when Olivia arrived, and how I had taken control of the situation, because someone had to, and if I hadn't, she would have died on that table. The board members were writing furiously, and I could see the hospital administrator's face growing more and more pale with each detail I revealed, because he was starting to realize just how badly this could reflect on the institution he was supposed to be managing. Meanwhile, word had spread throughout the hospital like wildfire that the woman in room 247 was the governor's daughter, and suddenly every nurse and doctor who had spent years ignoring me was trying to get close to me in the hallways, asking me questions, and offering to help with anything I needed, and it was almost comical how transparent their sudden interest was. The same nurses who wouldn't sit with me at lunch were now inviting me to join them, and the doctors who used to call for other nurses during emergencies were suddenly praising my quick thinking and medical expertise. I just smiled politely and kept doing my job because I wasn't interested in their fake friendship or their desperate attempts to align themselves with someone who now had the governor's attention. But the real drama started that afternoon when Dr. Reynolds was called into a closed-door meeting with the hospital board and the governor's chief of staff, and I happened to be walking past the conference room when I heard raised voices coming from inside. Through the glass panel in the door, I could see Reynolds standing in front of the long conference table, looking like a defendant at trial, while the board members sat in judgment, and even though I couldn't hear every word, I caught enough to understand that his entire career was being dissected and examined under a microscope. Someone mentioned the word negligence, and someone else said systematic discrimination, and I saw Reynolds' face go from defensive to desperate as he realized that his actions over the years had finally caught up with him. That evening, Olivia was moved to a private suite on the top floor of the hospital, and she asked specifically for me to be assigned as her primary nurse, and when the nursing director tried to suggest that perhaps a more senior nurse would be more appropriate, Olivia looked at her with those sharp, intelligent eyes and said, "I don't want a more senior nurse. I want the nurse who saved my life. And unless you're suggesting that Charli isn't qualified to provide care, then I expect to see her on my care team immediately." The nursing director, who had spent the last 7 years treating me like I was barely competent enough to empty bedpans, suddenly couldn't agree fast enough. And just like that, I was assigned to the governor's daughter with a private room and resources I had never dreamed of having access to. Over the next few days, as Olivia recovered, we spent hours talking, and I learned that she wasn't just the governor's daughter, living off her family's name and wealth, but actually a civil rights attorney who specialized in workplace discrimination cases. And when I mentioned this, she smiled and said, "Charli, do you think it's a coincidence that I'm asking you so many questions about how you've been treated here? Because I'm not just recovering from my injuries, I'm building a case." My heart started racing as I realized what she meant, and she continued, "I've been listening to the other nurses talk when they think I'm asleep, and I've been watching how the doctors interact with you versus how they interact with the senior staff. And what I'm seeing is a textbook case of workplace harassment and discrimination." Page 3. I felt my hands start to shake as Olivia laid out what she had observed, and she reached over and took my hand again, just like she had done that first morning, and she said, "You saved my life, Charli, and now I'm going to save your career. Because what's happening in this hospital is not just wrong, it's illegal, and I have the resources and the connections to make sure that everyone who has mistreated you faces consequences." I wanted to tell her that it wasn't necessary, that I was used to being overlooked, and that making waves would only make things worse for me. But before I could say anything, she held up her hand and said, "Don't you dare tell me to let this go, because I've spent my entire legal career fighting for people who were too afraid to fight for themselves, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let the woman who saved my life continue to be treated like garbage in her own workplace." The next morning, Governor Hartwell returned to the hospital with a team of state labor investigators, and I watched from Olivia's room as they spread out through the building, interviewing staff members and reviewing employment records and scheduling documents. The nursing director was called in for questioning, and she emerged 2 hours later looking like she had aged 10 years, with mascara streaked down her face and her hands trembling as she clutched a folder full of documents. Word spread quickly that the investigators were looking into allegations of systematic workplace discrimination and hostile work environment, and suddenly the nurses who had been so eager to befriend me a few days ago were avoiding eye contact and scurrying away whenever I walked down the hallway because they knew that their treatment of me over the years was about to be exposed. Dr. Reynolds tried to save himself by throwing everyone else under the bus, and I sat in on one of the investigation meetings where he claimed that he had always respected my work and that any mistreatment I had experienced was the fault of the nursing staff and the hospital administration. But Olivia had already provided the investigators with a recording she had made on her phone of Reynolds talking to another doctor outside her room, where he had said something about how he couldn't believe that nobody nursed Charli had somehow managed to save the governor's daughter, and how it was just dumb luck that she hadn't killed the patient with her incompetence. The investigators played that recording in the meeting, and I watched Reynolds' face crumble as he realized that his own words had sealed his fate. Within a week, the hospital board made their decision, and it was announced that Dr. Reynolds was being terminated effective immediately for conduct unbecoming of a medical professional and for creating a hostile work environment that had endangered patient care. The nursing director was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation, and 3 other senior nurses who had been particularly cruel to me over the years were given formal reprimands and mandatory retraining on workplace conduct. The hospital administrator held a press conference where he announced sweeping changes to the facility's employment policies and patient care protocols, and he made a point of mentioning that these changes were being implemented based on the recommendations of nurse Charli Dawson, who had demonstrated exceptional skill and dedication during a critical emergency situation. But the real miracle happened 2 weeks after Olivia had been admitted, when she was finally cleared to go home, and Governor Hartwell came to pick her up along with what seemed like half the state government, and before she left, she asked me to come to her room because she had something she wanted to give me. I walked in, expecting maybe a thank you card or perhaps a small gift, but instead, I found Olivia standing by the window in her street clothes, looking strong and healthy, and nothing like the dying woman I had pulled back from death's door, and she turned to me with tears in her eyes and said, "Charli, I've been thinking about what I can do to properly thank you for saving my life, and I realized that the best gift I can give you is opportunity." She handed me an envelope, and when I opened it, I found a letter of recommendation written on the governor's official letterhead and signed by both the governor and Olivia herself, describing my actions in detail and praising my medical expertise and my dedication to patient care. But that wasn't all, because underneath the letter was another document, and when I read it, my breath caught in my throat, because it was a full scholarship offer to Johns Hopkins University's advanced nursing program, with all expenses paid, including housing and a living stipend, and a guaranteed position at one of the top hospitals in Baltimore upon completion of the program. I looked up at Olivia with tears streaming down my face, and I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come, and she just smiled and said, "You deserve this, Charli, and so much more. And I'm not going to let you waste another minute of your life in a place that doesn't appreciate your value." The next few months were like living in a dream, and I completed my remaining shifts at St. Anne Medical Center while preparing for my move to Baltimore, and the transformation in how I was treated at the hospital was almost comical, because suddenly everyone wanted to be associated with me, and doctors who had never spoken to me before were asking if I would consider staying on staff and offering me promotions and pay raises that should have been given to me years ago. But I knew that their sudden change of heart had nothing to do with finally recognizing my worth, and everything to do with protecting their own reputations now that the governor's office was watching the hospital like a hawk. So I politely declined all their offers and counted down the days until I could leave that place behind forever. On my last day of work, the staff threw me a going-away party that felt more like a funeral for their guilty consciences, and they gave speeches about what a valued member of the team I had been and how much I would be missed, and I just stood there with a polite smile on my face, thinking about all the times these same people had made me feel worthless and invisible. But then something unexpected happened because one of the younger nurses, a girl named Emma, who had only been working at the hospital for about 6 months, came up to me with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Charli, I just want you to know that watching what happened with you has changed my life." Because I was starting to think that maybe I wasn't cut out for nursing because of how some of the senior staff treated me. But seeing you stand up for yourself and seeing justice actually happen has given me hope that things can change. I hugged Emma, and I told her that she should never let anyone make her doubt her abilities, and that the most important thing she could do was to keep being kind and competent and dedicated, because eventually the right people would notice. And I gave her my phone number and told her to call me anytime she needed advice or just someone to talk to. As I drove away from St. Anne Medical Center for the last time, I looked in my rearview mirror at the building where I had spent 7 years of my life, feeling invisible and undervalued, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders because I knew that I was finally moving towards something better. Page 4, Johns Hopkins, was everything I had dreamed it would be, and more, because from the very first day of the program, I was surrounded by people who respected nursing as a profession and who valued expertise and dedication over politics and social hierarchies. My instructors were brilliant and demanding, and they pushed me to expand my knowledge and skills in ways I had never imagined possible. And for the first time in my career, I felt like I was being challenged rather than just tolerated. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised even me because I had spent so many years operating at half capacity, just trying to survive in a toxic environment, that I had forgotten what it felt like to actually use my full potential. The other students in my program came from all over the country, and many of them had stories similar to mine about working in hospitals where they had been overlooked or undervalued despite their skills, and we formed a tight bond based on our shared determination to prove that we were capable of greatness. We studied together late into the night, reviewing case studies and practicing advanced procedures and discussing the latest research in emergency medicine and critical care. And I felt my confidence growing with each passing week as I mastered techniques and concepts that would have been far beyond my reach at St. Anne Medical Center. But I never forgot about Olivia and the role she had played in changing my life. And we stayed in touch through regular phone calls and occasional visits when she was in Baltimore for legal conferences or meetings. She had fully recovered from her injuries and had gone back to her work as a civil rights attorney, and she told me that the case she had built against St. Anne Medical Center had resulted in a massive settlement that was being used to fund workplace reform initiatives and support programs for healthcare workers who had experienced discrimination or harassment. She also mentioned that Dr. Reynolds had been unable to find work at any reputable medical facility because word had spread throughout the medical community about what he had done, and he had last been heard from working at a small urgent care clinic in a rural area, making a fraction of what he used to earn. I felt a complicated mix of emotions when I heard about Reynolds' downfall because part of me felt vindicated that he was finally facing consequences for his behavior, but another part of me just felt sad that someone with his medical training had wasted his talent by being cruel and petty instead of focusing on helping patients. But Olivia reminded me that Reynolds had made his own choices and that the consequences he was facing were entirely of his own making. And she said that sometimes the best thing we can do for toxic people is to let them experience the natural results of their actions so that hopefully they can learn and grow from the experience. During my second year at Johns Hopkins, something incredible happened that I never could have predicted because I was selected to participate in a special research project studying trauma response protocols in emergency situations, and the project was being funded by a grant from the governor's office, specifically designated for advancing emergency medical care in Pennsylvania. When I found out about the governor's involvement, I called Olivia to thank her, and she laughed and said, "Charli, you earned that spot based on your own merits, because the selection committee didn't even know about your connection to my family until after they had chosen you And my father only got involved because he wanted to support innovative research that could save lives. The research project was intense and demanding, and it required me to work alongside some of the top emergency medicine physicians in the country, analyzing data from thousands of emergency room cases and identifying patterns in successful versus unsuccessful trauma responses. We were looking at factors like response time and team coordination and individual decision-making under pressure. And as I dug into the research, I realized that the things I had done instinctively the night I saved Olivia's life were actually consistent with best practices that had been identified through decades of emergency medicine research. It was validation that my actions that night had not been just lucky guesses, but rather the result of solid training and good instincts and a genuine commitment to patient care. The research project culminated in a presentation at a national emergency medicine conference in Chicago, and I was chosen to be one of the presenters sharing our findings with an audience of over 2,000 medical professionals from around the world. I was terrified standing backstage waiting for my turn to speak because this was so far outside my comfort zone, and I kept thinking about all the times at St. Anne Medical Center when I had been told that my opinions didn't matter and that I should just keep quiet and do what I was told. But then I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and when I checked it, I saw a text message from Olivia that said, "You were born for this moment, Charli. So get out there and show them what real nursing looks like." I walked out onto that stage with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. But as soon as I started talking about the research and the data and the implications for improving emergency care, something clicked inside me. And suddenly I wasn't nervous anymore because I was talking about something I genuinely understood and cared about deeply. I spoke for 20 minutes about our findings and recommendations, and when I finished, the audience erupted in applause. And several prominent physicians came up to me afterwards to ask questions and exchange contact information and tell me that my presentation had been one of the highlights of the conference. That night, I sat in my hotel room in Chicago looking out at the city lights and thinking about how far I had come from that scared, invisible nurse who had spent 7 years being treated like she didn't matter. And I felt overwhelming gratitude not just for Olivia and the governor and the opportunities they had given me, but also for that stormy night when fate had put me in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to make a difference. I realized that every difficult moment I had endured at St. Anne Medical Center had been preparing me for something bigger, and that if I had given up or transferred to another hospital or let the toxicity break my spirit, then I never would have been there to save Olivia's life, and none of the amazing things that had happened since would have been possible. Page 5. After I completed my advanced nursing degree at Johns Hopkins, I had multiple job offers from prestigious hospitals around the country, but I kept thinking about Emma and the other young nurses who were still working in environments like St. Anne Medical Center. And I realized that the most meaningful thing I could do with my new knowledge and credentials was to go back to Pennsylvania and try to create change from within the system. So I accepted a position as the Director of Emergency Nursing at Mercy General Hospital in Pittsburgh, which was one of the largest trauma centers in the state and had a reputation for innovation and progressive leadership. My first day at Mercy General was surreal, because instead of being the invisible nobody nurse, I was now walking into a hospital as a department director with real authority and the ability to shape policy and culture, and I was determined to use that power to create the kind of workplace environment that I had always wished existed. I met with the nursing staff and told them that my door was always open and that I valued their input and their expertise, and that my goal was to create a team where everyone felt respected and supported regardless of their seniority or background. But I also made it clear that I would not tolerate the kind of toxic behavior that had made my years at St. Anne Medical Center so miserable, and I implemented new policies requiring all staff members to complete mandatory training on workplace respect and professional conduct, and I created an anonymous reporting system so that nurses who experienced harassment or discrimination would have a safe way to speak up without fear of retaliation. Some of the older nurses were resistant to these changes at first because they were used to operating under the old hierarchical system where seniority meant you could treat junior staff however you wanted. But I stood firm and made it clear that anyone who couldn't adapt to the new culture was welcome to find employment elsewhere. Within 6 months, we started seeing results as staff satisfaction scores improved dramatically and turnover rates dropped. And our emergency department's patient care metrics began to rise because nurses who felt valued and respected were more engaged and more willing to go above and beyond for their patients. We started receiving recognition from state healthcare organizations for our innovative approaches to team building and staff development, and other hospitals began reaching out to ask if they could send their leadership teams to observe our operations and learn from our model. During this time, I stayed close with Olivia, and she had been elected to the state legislature, running on a platform of healthcare reform and workers' rights, and she used her position to advocate for policies that would protect healthcare workers from the kind of systemic mistreatment that had been so common in the industry. She introduced legislation requiring mandatory workplace culture assessments at all hospitals, receiving state funding and creating stronger protections for whistleblowers who reported unsafe or unethical practices. And while not all of her proposals passed, she succeeded in shifting the conversation and making hospital administrators more aware that they would be held accountable for how they treated their staff. Then one day, about 3 years after I had started at Mercy General, I got a phone call that stopped me in my tracks because it was from the CEO of St. Anne Medical Center, asking if I would be willing to come back to the hospital where my career had nearly been destroyed, not as a staff nurse, but as their new chief nursing officer with complete authority to restructure the nursing department and implement whatever changes I felt were necessary. My first instinct was to laugh and hang up because the irony was almost too much to bear, but the CEO kept talking and explained that the hospital had gone through several leadership changes since I had left, and that they were still struggling with high turnover and low morale and poor patient satisfaction scores, and that the board had specifically requested that they reach out to me because they had been following my success at Mercy General and believed that I was the only person who could turn things around. I told the CEO that I would need to think about it, and after I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the wall and trying to process what had just happened, because part of me wanted nothing to do with St. Anne Medical Center and all the painful memories associated with that place. But another part of me recognized that this was an opportunity to go back and fix the broken system that had caused me so much pain and potentially prevent other nurses from going through what I had experienced. I called Olivia that evening and told her about the offer, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "Charli, only you can decide if this is the right move, but I will say that there would be a beautiful symmetry in you returning to the place that tried to break you and transforming it into something better." I negotiated with St. Anne Medical Center for 2 weeks, and I made it clear that I would only accept the position if I had complete autonomy over nursing operations and a direct line of communication to the hospital board and a substantial budget for staff training and development. And to my surprise, they agreed to all of my conditions because they were desperate for change and willing to give me the authority I needed to make it happen. So 6 months later, I found myself walking back through the doors of St. Anne Medical Center for the first time in nearly 4 years. But this time, I was walking in as the chief nursing officer and the person responsible for the well-being and professional development of over 300 nurses. The transformation I implemented at St. Anne Medical Center didn't happen overnight because culture change never does. But I was patient and persistent, and I started by meeting, individually with every single nurse on staff to hear their stories and understand their concerns and get their input on what needed to change. I heard heartbreaking accounts of bullying and favoritism and nurses being blamed for systemic problems that were beyond their control. And I listened without judgment and took detailed notes and promised that things were going to be different moving forward. Then I started making changes, beginning with a complete overhaul of the scheduling system to ensure that assignments were distributed fairly based on skills and experience rather than politics and personal relationships. And I restructured the reporting hierarchy to eliminate the toxic power dynamics that had allowed senior nurses to mistreat their junior colleagues without consequences. I brought in outside consultants to conduct workplace culture training, and I implemented a mentorship program, pairing experienced nurses with newer staff members to create supportive relationships rather than competitive ones. And I established regular town hall meetings where nurses could voice their concerns directly to leadership without fear of retaliation. Not everyone was happy with the changes, especially some of the senior nurses who had benefited from the old system and who resented having their privileges challenged, but I remained firm in my commitment to creating a fair and respectful workplace. And when a few particularly resistant staff members continued to engage in bullying behavior, despite multiple warnings, I made the difficult decision to terminate their employment, because I knew that allowing toxic people to remain on staff would undermine everything I was trying to build. It sent a clear message to everyone else that the new culture was here to stay, and that no one was above accountability. Page 6. About a year into my tenure as Chief Nursing Officer at St. Anne Medical Center, something happened that brought everything full circle in the most unexpected way, because we admitted a patient to the emergency department who'd been involved in a serious car accident, and when I reviewed the case file, I was stunned to see the patient's name listed as Dr. Marcus Reynolds. I felt my heart start to race as I realized that the same doctor who had spent years making my life miserable was now lying in a hospital bed dependent on the care of the nursing staff he had once treated with such contempt. And for a moment, I had to sit down and take several deep breaths to process the emotions flooding through me. I went down to the emergency department to see for myself, and there he was, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him, with monitors beeping and IV lines running into his arms and his eyes closed as he drifted in and out of consciousness from the pain medication. The nurse assigned to his care was a young woman named Sarah, who had been one of my first hires after I became Chief Nursing Officer, and she looked up when I entered the room and said, "Chief Dawson, I didn't realize you knew this patient," and I told her that Dr. Reynolds and I had worked together many years ago and that I wanted to make sure he received excellent care despite our complicated history. Over the next several days, as Reynolds recovered from his injuries and regained consciousness, I made a point of checking on him regularly and ensuring that he was being treated with the same respect and dignity that we showed to every patient in our facility, regardless of who they were or what they had done in their past. The other nurses were confused by my attention to his case because word had spread about how Reynolds had treated me back when I was a staff nurse, and some of them expected me to be vindictive or at least indifferent to his suffering. But I explained to them that providing compassionate care to people we don't like or who have hurt us is one of the most important aspects of being a healthcare professional. When Reynolds was finally alert enough to have a conversation, I went into his room and pulled up a chair beside his bed, and he looked at me with eyes full of shame and recognition, and he said in a hoarse voice, "Charli, I heard that you're running this place now, and I just want you to know that I don't expect any special treatment, and I wouldn't blame you if you assigned the worst nurses to my care after everything I did to you." I looked at him for a long moment before responding, and then I said, "Dr. Reynolds, you're going to receive the same excellent care that every patient in this hospital receives, because that's the culture I've built here, and that's the standard we maintain regardless of personal feelings. He was quiet for a moment, and then tears started rolling down his cheeks, and he said, "I've had a lot of time to think about my life and my career over the past few years, and I want you to know that what happened to me professionally was entirely my own fault, because I let arrogance and insecurity turn me into someone cruel, and I hurt a lot of good people, including you, and I'm truly sorry." I felt something shift inside me as I listened to his apology, because I realized that I had been carrying around anger and resentment toward this man for so many years, and it had been weighing me down even as I achieved success and built a fulfilling career. And in that moment, I made the decision to let it go, not because he deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved the freedom that comes from releasing old grudges. I told Reynolds that I accepted his apology and that I hoped he would use his experience as an opportunity to reflect on the kind of physician and person he wanted to be moving forward. And he nodded and said that he had been doing a lot of soul-searching and that he had come to realize that his mistreatment of nurses and junior staff had stemmed from his own deep insecurity about whether he was really as competent as he pretended to be. He said that putting other people down had been his way of trying to feel superior and mask his own doubts, but that it had ultimately cost him everything he had worked for and left him isolated and miserable. We talked for over an hour that day, and it was one of the most honest and vulnerable conversations I had ever had with another healthcare professional, because we both acknowledged our shared humanity and our shared brokenness and the ways that the medical system can bring out either the best or the worst in people, depending on how we choose to respond to pressure and stress. When I finally left his room, I felt lighter than I had in years because I realized that my journey had come full circle and that the scared, invisible nurse who had saved Olivia Hartwell's life in a storm had grown into someone who could offer grace and compassion even to the person who had caused her so much pain. Reynolds was discharged 2 weeks later, and he sent me a handwritten letter thanking me for the care he had received and for treating him with dignity when he didn't deserve it. And he said that my example had inspired him to make some major changes in his own life and approach to medicine. I heard through the medical community grapevine that he had enrolled in a program for physicians struggling with burnout and unprofessional behavior, and that he was working with a therapist to address the underlying issues that had driven his toxic behavior. And while I had no idea whether his transformation would be lasting, I chose to believe that people are capable of change when they're willing to do the difficult work of looking honestly at themselves. Meanwhile, St. Anne Medical Center continued to thrive under the new leadership and culture I had established, and we received national recognition as one of the top hospitals in the country for nursing excellence and workplace satisfaction, and our emergency department's patient outcomes improved so dramatically that we became a teaching site for other hospitals trying to implement similar reforms. I was invited to speak at conferences around the world sharing our story and the lessons we had learned about the importance of treating healthcare workers with respect and creating environments where people feel valued and empowered to do their best work. But the most meaningful recognition came from the nurses themselves, who told me that coming to work no longer filled them with dread, and that they felt proud to be part of a team where excellence and compassion were valued more than hierarchy and politics. Young nurses who were just starting their careers told me that St. Anne Medical Center was their first choice for employment because they had heard about our culture and our commitment to supporting professional development, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that I had succeeded in creating the kind of workplace environment I had always wished existed when I was struggling through those difficult years as an invisible, nobody nurse. Page 7. 5 years after I returned to St. Anne Medical Center as Chief Nursing Officer, an invitation arrived that would mark another significant milestone in my journey because I was asked to testify before a congressional committee that was investigating workplace conditions in healthcare facilities across the country and developing legislation to establish national standards for protecting healthcare workers from harassment and discrimination. Olivia, who was now serving as a state senator, had been instrumental in organizing the hearings, and she had specifically requested that I be included as a witness because she believed my story illustrated both the problems within the system and the potential for meaningful change. I flew to Washington, D.C. and sat in the ornate hearing room surrounded by politicians and policy experts and advocates, and when it was my turn to speak, I told my story starting from those early days when I was just a young nurse trying to find her place in a toxic hospital environment through that fateful stormy night when I saved Olivia's life, and everything changed and ending with the transformation I had led at St. Anne Medical Center. I spoke about the talented nurses I had known who had left the profession entirely because they couldn't endure the constant belittlement and lack of support. And I talked about how investing in positive workplace culture wasn't just good for employees, but actually resulted in better patient outcomes and reduced costs and improved community health. The committee members asked thoughtful questions, and several of them thanked me for my courage in speaking out about issues that many healthcare workers were too afraid to discuss publicly because they feared retaliation from their employers. One senator, who had been a nurse earlier in her career, came up to me after the hearing with tears in her eyes and said that my testimony had brought back memories of her own experiences with workplace toxicity, and that she was committed to making sure the legislation would include strong protections for whistleblowers and meaningful penalties for institutions that failed to address toxic workplace cultures. The legislation that eventually passed wasn't perfect because political compromise never produces ideal outcomes, but it did establish important protections for healthcare workers and created mechanisms for investigating complaints and holding institutions accountable. And Olivia told me that my testimony had been crucial in convincing skeptical lawmakers that these issues were real and serious and deserving of federal attention. I felt honored to have played a role in creating systemic change that would benefit healthcare workers across the entire country. And I thought about all the young nurses like Emma, who would hopefully have better experiences than I had because people were finally paying attention to these issues. But even as I was achieving success on a national stage, the work that mattered most to me continued to be the daily interactions with nurses at St. Anne Medical Center because I knew that real change happened not through grand gestures or legislation, but through countless small moments of choosing to treat people with dignity and respect and helping them develop their skills and reach their potential. I made it a practice to spend time on the floors talking with staff nurses and asking about their challenges and celebrating their successes, and I tried to be the kind of leader I had needed during those difficult early years of my career. One afternoon, I was making rounds in the emergency department when I noticed a young nurse standing frozen in the corner, looking terrified as a patient coded and the rest of the team sprang into action around her. I recognized that look of paralyzing fear because I had felt it myself many times during my early years, and I walked over to her and gently touched her arm and said, "It's okay, Sarah. I know this is scary, but you have the training and skills you need, so take a deep breath and tell me what you think we should do next." She looked at me with wide eyes and stammered something about checking the airway, and I nodded encouragingly and said, "That's exactly right, so go ahead and do it, and I'll be right here beside you." I watched as Sarah stepped forward with shaking hands and began assisting with the code, and even though her movements were hesitant and uncertain, she did everything correctly, and when the patient's heart rhythm stabilized and the crisis passed, she turned to me with a look of amazed relief and said, "I can't believe I actually did that." I smiled and said, "I always knew you could because I've seen your work and I know you're capable of handling difficult situations, and you just proved that to yourself. And now, the next time something like this happens, you'll have that experience to draw on and you'll be a little less afraid." Later that day, Sarah came to my office and thanked me for believing in her and told me that she had been seriously considering leaving nursing because she felt overwhelmed and inadequate, but that my support during the code had reminded her why she had chosen this profession in the first place. She said that she wanted to be the kind of nurse I was someday, and I told her that she already had everything she needed inside her, and that my role was simply to help her recognize and develop those qualities. As she left my office, I thought about how that moment of encouragement might change the trajectory of her entire career, just as Olivia's support had changed mine, and I felt grateful that I was in a position to pay forward the kindness and belief that had been shown to me. Around this time, Olivia called me with news that she was getting married to a fellow attorney she had met while working on a healthcare reform case, and she asked if I would stand up with her as a bridesmaid, because she said that I wasn't just the person who had saved her life, but one of her closest friends, and someone whose presence on our wedding day would make it complete. I was deeply touched by the invitation, and I told her that I would be honored to be part of her celebration. And when the wedding day arrived, I stood beside her in a beautiful garden ceremony and watched as she married someone who clearly adored her, and I felt overwhelmed with happiness for my friend and gratitude for the bond we had formed. At the reception, Olivia gave a toast, and she told the story of how we had met on that stormy night when she had been at death's door, and how my quick thinking and skilled care had given her a second chance at life. And she said that she had learned from me that true strength isn't about power or status, but about having the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching or appreciating your efforts. She raised her glass and said to Charli, who taught me that one person really can make a difference, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who quietly show up and do their jobs with excellence and compassion, even when they're not getting recognition or thanks. The guests applauded, and many of them came up to me afterwards wanting to hear more of the story, and I found myself retelling the events of that night and the journey that had followed, and each time I told it, I was struck by how improbable it all seemed, and yet how inevitable it felt, because every difficult experience and every moment of struggle had been preparing me for the opportunities that would come later. I realized that my story wasn't really about one dramatic night or one lucky break, but about the daily choice to maintain integrity and competence and compassion, even in the face of adversity and mistreatment, because you never know when that foundation of excellence will create an opportunity for something extraordinary to happen. Page 8, finale, 10 years after that stormy night when everything changed. I stood in the main conference room at St. Anne Medical Center, surrounded by nursing staff and hospital leadership and community members who had gathered for a special ceremony that I had been told was to honor the hospital's anniversary, but which I quickly realized was actually focused on something entirely different. The hospital board chairman took the microphone and began talking about transformation and leadership and the power of one person to change an entire organization. And I started to get an uncomfortable feeling about where this was heading. Then Governor Hartwell walked into the room, followed by Olivia, who was now a state senator and one of the most influential voices in healthcare policy, and my heart started racing because I still wasn't used to being the center of attention even after all these years. The governor approached the podium and said that he was there to present a special recognition that had been approved by the state legislature. And as he spoke, he recounted the story of how his daughter had been saved by a nurse who'd been overlooked and undervalued by the very institution she worked for, and how that nurse had gone on to transform not just one hospital, but the entire approach to nursing leadership and workplace culture across Pennsylvania and beyond. He unveiled a plaque that would be permanently mounted in the hospital's main entrance hall, dedicating the emergency department in my name and establishing an annual scholarship fund for nursing students who demonstrated both clinical excellence and commitment to advocating for positive workplace culture. I felt tears streaming down my face as I tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. And when Olivia hugged me, she whispered in my ear, "You earned every bit of this, Charli, and I'm so proud of the legacy you're building." But the real surprise came When Sarah, the young nurse I had mentored during that code years earlier, stepped forward with a group of other nurses I had trained and supported over the years, and they presented me with a leather-bound book filled with letters and photographs and stories from nurses all across the state who said that my leadership and example had inspired them to stay in the profession during difficult times and to believe that they could make a difference in their own workplaces. I opened the book with shaking hands and read message after message from people thanking me for showing them what nursing leadership could look like when it was rooted in respect and empathy and excellence rather than hierarchy and ego. One letter in particular caught my attention because it was from Emma, the young nurse from St. Anne Medical Center, who had approached me on my last day years ago and told me that my story had given her hope. She wrote that she was now the nurse manager at a hospital in Philadelphia and that she had implemented many of the same policies and practices I had pioneered, and that she was seeing the same positive results in terms of staff satisfaction and patient outcomes, and she wanted me to know that the ripple effects of what I had started were spreading far beyond what I could see or measure. As the ceremony concluded and people came forward to congratulate me and take photos, I found myself thinking about that young, frightened version of myself who used to walk these same hallways, feeling invisible and worthless, wondering if she would ever find a place where her skills and dedication were valued. I wished I could go back and tell her that every moment of struggle and every experience of being overlooked was building something inside her that would eventually become the foundation for helping thousands of other nurses find their voices and reach their potential. Later that evening, after everyone had left and the hospital had settled into its usual nighttime rhythm, I walked down to the emergency department and stood in the exact spot where Olivia's stretcher had been wheeled in on that stormy night a decade ago. I remembered the fear and the adrenaline and the absolute certainty that I knew what needed to be done even though no one else seemed to believe in me, and I realized that the real miracle of that night wasn't that I had saved Olivia's life, but that I had finally saved my own life by proving to myself that I was capable and competent and worthy of taking up space in the world. My phone buzzed with a text message from Olivia saying, "I'm watching the news coverage of today's ceremony, and I'm crying all over again because seeing you honored like this is everything I hoped would happen when I first asked my father to help you all those years ago. And I want you to know that you didn't just save my life that night. You showed me what true heroism looks like, and you've inspired me in every aspect of my work ever since." I typed back a response, thanking her for being the catalyst that changed everything, and for using her privilege and platform to create opportunities for someone who had no power or connections, and for remaining a true friend through all the years that followed. I told her that I hoped she knew how rare and precious it was to meet someone who genuinely wanted to help others succeed without expecting anything in return, and that her generosity had created a ripple effect that was now touching lives across the entire state and beyond. As I prepared to leave the hospital that night, I stopped by the nurses' station where a young nurse I didn't recognize was sitting alone doing paperwork during a quiet moment, and she looked up when I approached, and I could see the tiredness in her eyes and the slight slump of her shoulders that suggested she was carrying a heavy burden. I asked her how her shift was going, and she sighed and said it was fine, but that she sometimes felt like no matter how hard she worked or how much she cared about her patients, nobody really noticed or appreciated what nurses did. I pulled up a chair and sat down beside her, and I told her that I understood exactly how she felt, because I had spent years feeling the same way, and I shared a condensed version of my story about being invisible and overlooked, and how one night of doing my job with excellence and compassion had opened doors I never imagined possible. I told her that the most important thing she could do was to keep showing up and doing excellent work, even when it felt like nobody was watching, because you never know when an opportunity will present itself, and when that moment comes, you want to be ready. The young nurse, whose name tag identified her as Jessica, looked at me with wide eyes and said, "Wait, "Are you Charli Dawson, the person they just named the emergency department after?" And when I nodded, she said, "Oh my God, I read about you in nursing school, and you're like a legend, and I can't believe I'm actually talking to you right now." I laughed and told her that I was just a regular nurse who'd been given some extraordinary opportunities, and that she had just as much potential to make a difference in her own way, and that I hoped she would remember this conversation during the difficult moments and use it as encouragement to keep pushing forward. As I finally walked out of St. Anne Medical Center into the cool evening air, I looked up at the stars and thought about the incredible journey that had brought me to this moment, and I felt overwhelming gratitude for every single experience, both good and bad, because each one had shaped me into the person I had become. I thought about Dr. Reynolds and the nursing director and all the people who had treated me poorly over the years, and I realized that I no longer felt any anger or resentment toward them because their toxicity had ultimately pushed me to become stronger and more determined and more compassionate toward others who face similar struggles. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages and emails from nurses across the country who had seen news coverage of the ceremony and wanted to share their own stories of workplace challenges and to thank me for speaking openly about issues that many people preferred to ignore. I spent hours responding to messages and offering encouragement and advice, and I was struck by how many talented, dedicated healthcare workers were struggling in toxic environments and how desperately they needed to know that change was possible and that their experiences were valid. One message in particular stood out because it was from a nurse working at a small rural hospital who said she was the only person of color on her nursing staff and that she faced constant microaggressions and exclusion from her colleagues, and she was considering leaving the profession entirely because she felt so isolated and demoralized. I called her immediately and we talked for over an hour about her experiences and her dreams and her fears, and I connected her with resources and mentorship opportunities, and I made sure she knew that her perspective and her presence in the nursing profession were valuable and needed. That conversation reminded me that while I had achieved success in transforming workplace culture at St. Anne Medical Center and influencing policy at the state level, there were still countless nurses across the country who were struggling in environments where they felt invisible and undervalued, just as I once had. I realized that my work was far from finished and that the next chapter of my career needed to focus on scaling the solutions I had implemented so that more healthcare workers could benefit from positive workplace cultures. So I made the decision to step down from my role as Chief Nursing Officer at St. Anne Medical Center and launch a national consulting firm focused on helping hospitals and healthcare systems transform their workplace cultures and leadership practices. It was a risk to leave the security and prestige of my position, but I knew that I could have a much greater impact by working with multiple organizations than by remaining in one place, and Olivia supported my decision completely and even helped me secure initial funding from philanthropic organizations interested in healthcare workforce development. The consulting firm grew rapidly as word spread about our evidence-based approach to culture change and our track record of producing measurable improvements in staff satisfaction and patient outcomes and retention rates. I hired a team of nurse consultants who had their own experiences with workplace toxicity and who were passionate about creating change. And together we developed training programs and assessment tools and intervention strategies that could be customized for different types of healthcare facilities. But I made sure that even as the business grew, I never lost touch with the frontline nurses who were doing the difficult daily work of caring for patients, because I remembered how isolating it felt to be at the bedside dealing with impossible workloads and inadequate support, while administrators made decisions from comfortable offices far removed from the realities of patient care. I insisted that our consulting engagements always include extensive time talking with staff nurses and listening to their perspectives and incorporating their insights into our recommendations, because I knew that sustainable change had to come from the ground up rather than being imposed from the top down. 5 years into running the consulting firm, I received an invitation that felt like the ultimate validation of everything I had worked to achieve, because I was asked to give the keynote address at the American Nurses Association's National Conference in front of an audience of over 10,000 nurses from all 50 states. I stood on that enormous stage looking out at a sea of faces representing every specialty and background and level of experience, and I told them the story of that stormy night when everything changed, and I challenged them to believe that they had the power to transform not just individual patient lives, but entire systems and cultures. I spoke about the importance of supporting one another rather than tearing each other down, and about refusing to accept toxic workplace conditions as inevitable or normal, and about using our collective voice to demand better from the institutions we serve and from the leaders who make decisions about our profession. I talked about how every nurse in that auditorium had probably experienced moments when they felt invisible or undervalued, and I urged them to hold on to their passion and their integrity during those difficult times, because they never knew when an opportunity would arise to make a difference that would ripple out in ways they couldn't imagine. The response to my keynote was overwhelming, and I spent hours after the speech talking with nurses who shared their own stories of struggle and triumph and transformation, and I was reminded once again that my experience was not unique, but rather representative of what so many healthcare workers face in a system that often fails to value or protect them. But I was also inspired by their resilience and their dedication and their refusal to give up on a profession they loved despite all the challenges they encountered. Now, as I sit here reflecting on the journey from that invisible, overlooked nurse to the person I've become, I realize that the real miracle wasn't the dramatic rescue or the governor's intervention or the career success that followed, but rather the simple act of staying true to myself and my values, even when it seemed like no one was watching or caring. Every time I chose to do excellent work despite being ignored, and every time I treated patients with compassion despite feeling undervalued, and every time I refused to become bitter or cynical despite the toxic environment around me, I was building the foundation for everything that came after. And the greatest gift I can give now is to help other nurses understand that they have that same power within themselves, and that their daily choices to show up with excellence and integrity and compassion matter more than they realize, because you never know which moment will be the one that changes everything. The stormy night when I saved Olivia Hartwell's life didn't make me a hero. It simply revealed what was already there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And my hope is that every nurse who hears this story will recognize that they too are carrying within themselves the seeds of transformation and impact and legacy that are just waiting for the right opportunity to bloom. Justice came for me not through revenge or vindication, but through the quiet, steady process of proving my worth and creating change and helping others find their voices and their power. And now when I walk through the halls of St. Anne Medical Center and see my name on that plaque in the emergency department, I don't think about the recognition or the honor, but about Jessica and Emma and Sarah and all the other young nurses who will walk past that plaque and maybe feel a spark of hope that they too can overcome obstacles and make a difference and transform not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touch. That's the real miracle, and that's the justice that matters most, because it doesn't just change one life, it changes thousands, and the ripples continue spreading outward, touching people I'll never meet in places I'll never visit. And that legacy of hope and empowerment and transformation is worth more than any award or recognition could ever be. The hospital ignored me until I saved the governor's daughter. But the truth is, they had been ignoring excellence all along. And once they finally saw it, they could never unsee it again. And that changed everything. Not just for me, but for every nurse who came after me. And that's how real lasting justice works, through transformation rather than retribution, through building something better rather than tearing down what was broken.